last time I presented this one to a big group, it was in Copenhagen at the IFOAM conference. That's the International Federation of Organic Movements. I'm gonna, yeah, it says that. I'm gonna kind of go off on a tangent from this a little bit, but it's a good way to start. But my big interest in my studies is agroecology. So what's agroecology? It's looking at the whole world. I mean, it as a system, not pieces, bits and pieces, you know. So it's like what we say in agronomy or crop management is, you know, if you call in a nematologist, the problem's always going to be a nematode. If you call in a plant pathologist, it's always going to be a disease. It's the tool they have to work with. So, but agroecology, we look at the big picture, how it all fits together. The climate, the environment, the culture, the people, the soil, the plant species, civilization itself, the rise and fall. How did people, and this has always interested me, since we found out, I mean, I may be wrong with the numbers, so don't criticize me if I get numbers wrong, because some of these numbers are controversial. But in the present form that we are today, same brain power, same everything, we go back at least 80,000 years. It could be much longer, but that's sort of in the ballpark of what we know now, or what we think we know now. So, you know, we have history kind of hazy that goes back maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years. So what happened in way back when? We have civilizations that have, you know, rise and fell. We're discovering new things all the time. It's pushing agriculture farther back, like the discovery in Turkey of Göbekli Tepe, which just kind of blew off everything we know about people, civilization, etc., like a very elaborate temple complex, and apparently a civilization that existed and for unknown reasons buried these structures, and they were only discovered maybe 20 years ago. So that pushes it back farther. We found remnants of modern humans in Paisley Cave in southeast Oregon that go back farther than that even. But my point is, how did they survive? What techniques were they using? And what examples do we have of true sustainability? Okay. So I was a consultant and also a farmer in Hawaii for a lot of years when I got fed up with California and that whole mess, you know. So I had the opportunity to observe Hawaiian agriculture and study it. Well, it's the only Stone Age culture that we have a good record of what their practices were. That's because there was naturalists along with Captain Cook and subsequent expeditions to Hawaii. And they wrote down everything, you know, the birds, the animals, the culture. And the main thing that they noticed was they were blown away by the productivity, the size of what they called potatoes. And of course it was, they grew sweet potatoes and taro, but they managed to have plenty to sell to Captain Cook and his guys, to keep them alive. And they were very large people, very athletic people, and they were in very good shape. These guys were, King Kamehameha was like almost 7 feet tall, 300 pounds. I mean, these are big dudes, you know. And they had high level nutrition. They lived on an island. Hawaiian agriculture is a model for sustainability because it's like a microcosm of the planet Earth. It's floating in space. This is an island 2,500 miles from the nearest landmass. And how did they get there? Of course, you know, the academic of the day were saying, well, they must have just drifted there. They were primitive. They didn't know how to go. No, you know, my neighbor Herb Connie proved that wrong by building a voyaging canoe, getting a navigator from Marshall Islands, and sailing it from Hawaii to Tahiti and back. without any modern navigation aids. So these people were smart folks, and they followed ecological principles, and their farming methods used by the specific methods for production. And they had laws or kapus to protect the ecosystem with the penalty of death. And then here's an example of a house and farm in Hawaii in 1878. Okay, so they came from Polynesia. They crossed from Asia, North Asia, down across archipelagos, and they navigated across the Pacific to Samoa, Tonga, Raiatura, all these islands, small islands in the South Pacific. And when their population grew too large, and a lot of times there was conflicts, and they just realized, that we probably, overpopulated things. They'd get in their ships and they'd sail out to another island and colonize that. So they eventually colonized Hawaii, and then from Hawaii they went to New Zealand. And so the point is, they had no inputs, they had no metals, they couldn't go buy stuff, there wasn't any imports. They were on their own on a volcanic island that was strictly, recent volcanism, one of the youngest pieces of ground on the earth, 3 or 4 active volcanoes that built that island, are still building that island to this day. So it had no mammals, it only had a bat. It had birds, and it had an owl, it had a hawk, and it had a whole bunch of birds that evolved there. But there was no mammals, there was no livestock, there was no food crops. There wasn't anything there to eat other than fish. Of course, these dudes knew how to fish, for sure. But they came prepared. They brought their what they call canoe plants. It was their set of plants that they use and they cultivate. And so when we look at examples that we know something about today, we have ancient Hawaiian and Mayan agroecology and sustainability and organic management. So the whole idea of this study and what I did was to find examples. I mean, people were saying, well, we got to find sustainability. We got to start regenerative farming. We got to, now wait a minute. There's already examples of that. It's like we don't really need to reinvent the wheel. Now, agroecology is about studying ancient farming techniques that were successful and also understanding why they failed and why civilizations failed. And understanding the principles. I'm not saying you guys go out here with an o'o bar, which is like a wooden staff, and make holes in the ground and plant a crop. No. Agroecology is about learning principles and then updating those with modern tools, is the idea. And it has a holistic thinking where we're combining all the elements and we're being ecological to be economical. So how could a bunch of people that are considered Stone Age survive on a volcanic island without any food plants or any livestock for thousands of years? To me, the principles behind that are the crucial examples of sustainable concepts, because it's reality. I mean, how many years does it have to be able to call something sustainable? Nobody's ever answered that. We're looking for sustainability. Well, what is sustainability? How many years does that take? Do I have to prove it to call it sustainable? Well, that's up to the powers to be, the puppet masters, I guess. But the point of agroecology is we look at the principles. How did they do it? How did they survive? How did they fail? And what were they doing? Because that's important. We live in the same world. We're the same people. We have the same needs. And so, like I say, analyzing the failure of systems or the success stories. So what did they do? That's probably what you guys want to know. Farming methods used. Okay. There's a thread that runs through all this. And I really should maybe start with the Maya and what we call milpa or slash and burn farming techniques. This kind of puts it in perspective. And I lived with the Maya in Belize, and they're still, they're still there. I mean, they don't live in those pyramids, but they're out there. And they're farming corn just like the ancient ancestors did. So here's the story. They'll go into the jungle, the forest, they'll fell the trees, they'll cut it down, maybe 5-acre patch, wait till dry season, burn it, go in there, and the only tool they have is a machete and a match. And then they go in there and plant corn by hand using a stick. And then they get an optimum corn yield. They do all kinds of things. I could tell you how they do it, but it doesn't really apply, These folks don't even have pack animals, vehicles or anything. They harvest the corn, put it in a sack on their back, and hike back to the village. And that may be 5 miles both ways. I mean, one way. They're still doing it. This is happening today. Okay, but the point of it is, they know they can only get 1 to 2 crops of corn and beans from that milpa, the area they burnt. And then it has to go back to jungle, to what they call bush, for 20 years. And they know if they only wait 10 years, they'll only get about half a crop. And they got thousands of years of experience, so they kind of know. And so the bottom line on this is it takes 20 years for the soil to recover from 1 or 2 years of corn crop. That's because you're in the tropics, it's a high rainfall, you got a high oxidation, and the humic substances have oxidized and gone away. And you have leaching, you have rainfall, and just plain oxidation. So they know that it takes 20 years of bush growing back, dropping leaves, branches, earthworms, all the things that happen over 20 years before they can get another good crop. So that to me is an example of humus and the importance of humic substances. Not just the importance, it takes 20 years if you don't do anything. If all you got is a machete and a match, and you don't have fertilizer inputs, you're gonna wait 20 years, okay? Now, if you're in Hawaii, you can't do that. You can't wait 20 years. The Maya, they had millions of acres. Nowadays, though, they're destroying the entire rainforest with that practice. So, how did people on an island, a really small island, you can drive around it in one day, manage to support a population much higher, maybe 2-3 times higher than it is today, successfully, without any imports, without buying stuff, without metals? They figured it out, okay? So, the use of, this is what they do. It's really kind of simple. The use of tree leaves, bark, and branches for compost and mulch were key sustainability factors. The use of nitrogen-fixing trees in an alley cropping arrangement with fruit trees like breadfruit. Minimum tillage. No plowing was done. Appointed staff called an OO was the only farm tool, because they didn't have metals. Okay, of course they didn't plow, because how would you plow? They had no animals. They had no draft animals or anything like that. They'd wait till night, on a clear night. They'd all get together as a group, and they'd go out there and till a guy's field with their OO bar. Agroforestry was highly advanced under the Apua'a system. Alley cropping was the method used in the Kona district. Rows of trees with crops between. Integrated polyculture crop farmers for 2,000 years. So what did they use for fertilizer? God, this is so complicated. They'd send little kids up the trees. They'd strip the leaves by hand off of trees. The kids would do it. And there's a tree called the kikuyu nut, which is also called the candle nut. It produces like a nut that's very high in oil, and you string that on a piece of bamboo, and you can light it, and it's like a candle. Okay, so that's what they used for lighting. But the leaves, they'd strip the leaves, and they would put them in an area that they had walled off with rock, which they had plenty of. And they would either flood it if they had water available, or if not, they wait till it was wet, rainy season. In Kona, that's going to be in the summer, spring and summer, it's pretty wet. They'd strip the leaves, they'd throw them in these, well, I use a Hawaiian word, but it's like paddock, like a paddy, enclosed area. And they would tromp them in with their feet. They'd throw the leaves in there, branches, leaves, and they'd tromp them in the mud with their feet, walking around in there. Done. That's the program. Then they'd let it decompose for a while, and then when the conditions were correct for planting, which they use moon phases and other things. They had kahunas, which are shaman, that direct the planting. Kahuna la'alau, lau means leaf, and that direct a lot of this. And it was kind of a feudal system, okay? So it's not comparable with anything we have, well, not really. So bottom line is, the only thing they had and what they used and what they were successful with was leaves from plants that produced the candle nut, a high energy plant, and other trees they had, a bunch of various hardwood trees. And then in more modern times, when the mango was introduced, which wasn't native, neither was pineapple, by the way, they'd strip leaves off the mango trees, because like everybody's got a mango tree in their backyard. And so you get fruit and you strip the leaves and you use them for your fertility program. So you might say, well, did they use manure? Well, they didn't have any livestock other than pigs. And yes, they did, but I'll get to that in a minute. But they did not use human waste. They did not use human waste. That was a kapu. What they call kapu means it's forbidden. So they weren't using human wastes. They knew that could lead to problems, apparently. And that was pretty much it, but that's not all. That's just the materials and methods. So basically they're using leaves, they're using a tillage implement made out of a very hard wood called koa, which they pry in the ground and kind of work the ground. And they did it at night. It was cool. And they would, after they take the crop off, and in this area that I'm talking about, sweet potatoes was the big crop, because they couldn't do as much flooded field agriculture where you grow taro, or what they call kaulo or taro, which was really a staple of the Hawaiian and Polynesian diet. That required a flooded situation, because when you flood and plant small plants, keikis, they get a jump on the weeds, right? So it's just like why you plant rice in water, because it gives it a jump on the weeds. And so after they'd harvest their crop, the reason they had stone walls all around these paddocks is because after they harvest their crop, they put pigs in there. And the pigs would root up the ground to eat the crop residues of the pieces of sweet potatoes and stuff that wasn't harvested. And, and so there's manure, they're rooting it up, they're getting it all plowed up. See, so that's the plowing part was done by the pigs. And then the next season they'd go in there with the leaves and the tromping and then the humification and plant another crop. So that worked for 3,000 years. So is that sustainable? I don't know. Until Europeans came and gave them diseases and wiped out the entire culture. Yeah. So one of the principles, we're talking about principles, is diversity breeds stability. And the point I would like to make about monoculture, I mean, we get ourselves in trouble with monoculture because you're setting the stage of perfect conditions for some kind of pest. It's perfect. And you got like 10,000 acres, it's one crop. No weeds, no place for beneficial insects. It just sets up scenarios. I used to work with strawberry farmers in California and Mexico, and they had mite problems, terrible mite problems. And, and I figured it out, it's like, God, you guys are just farming mites. I mean, you're creating the conditions, the perfect conditions. And then I found out that there's a natural fungus called Floridana, his last name is Neozygetes floridana. So it's a fungus that throws spores out, they land on a mite, the mycelia enters the mite through an orifice, digests the mite, and then produces spores that spread and continue the cycle. So I found in California that the control plants, that 10% of the mites were infected with this disease, right? Now we could go out there, and we did, with spores, and we infected like large areas, and we could control the mites. Okay, but here's the deal. So that fungus was out there controlling the mites, but they were worried about fungus diseases. So they're spraying fungicides every 3 days. So basically protecting the mites against the predators. Perfect. It's like they were deliberately raising mites. And I saw people lose $1 million in 1 week with strawberry crops like that. So in diversity, you have a lot more habitat for beneficials. And if you have soil life, there's fungus and spores out there that control these pests. And it's subtle stuff. Now these ancient people were into subtle things, subtle energy. And that's a whole other lecture, but it's pretty incredible. So we're talking about protecting the integrity of the ecosystem with laws. They weren't just shooting from the hip. They had laws, which were the kapus, that prevented deforestation and soil erosion. If you cut down a tree to make a canoe, you had to plant 10 more trees. Now, the kapus were punished by the death penalty. So they weren't fooling around, that gets interesting too, but these are the folks that killed Captain Cook, by the way, and consumed his body in a ritual because he was a powerful person. He would have mana. And so if you consume that person, you will get his mana or his vital energy. They thought at first he was Lono, the god that taught them agriculture, architecture, and mathematics, because Lono promised to return. He had left the Kealakekua on a flaming serpent, promising to return. Well, when they saw Captain Cook's ship show up, it must be Lono. And so they kind of greeted him, friendly. But then they found out, no, these guys are, no. They come limping back with a broken mast, and the Hawaiians are saying, this ain't Lono. Lono wouldn't have a broken mast limping back, and I don't know. So then Captain Cook tried to kidnap the chief. Well, that was a big mistake. because the chief had bodyguards that were over 6.5 feet, 7 feet tall, including King Kamehameha when he was a young guy. So they fired weapons at these Hawaiians. And they had tightly woven mat armor that could repel a gunshot. And they had Captain Cook's people traded with the Hawaiians iron implements like daggers and knives for food. Well, Hawaiians are they'll adopt new stuff readily. So they used the very same daggers that they traded from Captain Cook to kill Captain Cook when he tried to kidnap the chief. And it got ugly after that. But anyway, that's the kind of folks these were. So they use a living mulch system, rotations using sweet potatoes as a smother crop. So they were talking back to weeds. So of course they had weed problems. It's a weed. It's really bad today. It's really a weed patch with imported weeds. But they didn't have herbicides. They didn't have mechanical tillage or anything. So how are they going to control weeds? Crop rotations using a smothered crop. Now, our European ancestors also used a smothered crop, and that was hemp. Hemp is an excellent smothered crop. So when you build up a weed patch situation from row crop, then you go with a hemp crop as a smother crop. And so the use of a smother crop, flooded field systems for weed control and soil enrichment via nitrogen-fixing algae, cyanobacteria, a whole range of algae. And that's where they build ponds, and that's where they grew taro. They built all these irrigation systems that divert water into like a paddy pond. And then a very elaborate high-touch system of planting taro. And they use pesticidal plants for pest control. There's lots of plants in Hawaii, and these people were masters at knowing what those plants are good for. That's the kahuna, lapalau, like our herbal shaman. And they also had they knew the poisons too, and they wouldn't necessarily directly confront somebody and cause an issue, but they'd poison people that were troublemakers. So they knew all the plants and their properties. And they used aquaculture. They'd fence off areas in bays near the ocean or even inland with rocks and stones. And then they would have fish in there, which they'd feed them with the byproducts from producing poi, which is like a yogurt kind of a thing made from, it could be sweet potatoes, taro, it could be breadfruit. It's mashed up, fermented acidophilus, and then it's a paste. It's a very high starch, high nutrient thing. And then they did plant breeding, of course, so that they could get better resistance to surviving plants, quality factors like flavor. And then it's not like every man for himself. It's like the lone mountain man with these guys. Not at all. They work as a unit. Community developed irrigation systems, fish ponds and roads under supervision of full-time experts under the alii, which is the royalty. So it was a very organized thing. There wasn't any such thing as I'm going to go up here in the hill and start a farm, and no. This is about survival, and more than survival, it's about having a nice life. I mean, they had good times, and music, and sports, and ritual, and dance. They had time for all that. There's a very rich culture. And they were into all kinds of incredible sports activities, martial arts, this Alula slide, which is like a sled they make, go down grassy slopes. And I mean, these dudes were really they were having fun. Life to them was not just working and making money, because there wasn't any money. There was only the community, their family, their ancestry, their music, their dancing. Population growth and the use of ecosystems were controlled. these people were not fools. They knew that they had a limited ecosystem, and so they believed they used birth control. And again, they used herbal methods. You can prevent pregnancy in women by papaya seeds consumption. And they used ritual combat to reduce the male population. That sounds a little harsh, but that's what they did. You got all these high testosterone young males, and so they did have all kinds of ritualized combat and combat between clans. And it wasn't like nowadays where you just mow people down with machine guns. It was on a different kind of a level, okay? But it wasn't a peaceful world necessarily. But they sacrificed the people that they needed to sacrifice, the part of the population that was expendable, right? And they did that through ritualized combat. And they have some nasty martial arts and weapons, these folks did, and so they would, and then out-migration via large double-hulled vessels, the way the original natives came to Hawaii. So they get to a point where they would have to recolonize, go somewhere else. They went to New Zealand and became the Maoris, which are heavy-duty farmers to this day, and these are the top farmers in New Zealand now. And they originally came from Hawaii, which is kind of backtracking. Okay, here's kind of important stuff. The values, beyond the tools, the money, the production. Hawaiian values important to the formation of the culture. Now this could be any culture, okay? Here's the Hawaiian word, aloha. It means love and friendship. So when you meet Hawaiians, they'll give you an aloha. It's love and friendship. They'll touch noses. That's the ha. I breathe your breath in. Aloha. The ha. And we were called, white people, called howlies, people who no do ha. Because they wouldn't touch noses and breathe the other guy's breath, right? So they're the howlies. No do ha, right? Pono, moral and proper behavior. Ethics, dignity, moral and proper behavior. Na'upono, it's possessing a deep sense of justice. Like what's right and what's wrong. I'm not going to cheat you. If I tell you I'm going to do something, and I'm telling you this piece of equipment is in good shape, I'm telling the truth. Just like what I'm trying to tell you today about humic substances and biological agriculture. It's coming from these factors. Possessing a deep sense of justice, moral and proper behavior, and seeking knowledge. They were always seeking knowledge. They weren't necessarily too concerned with the stock market, sports scores, politics. Well, there wasn't any politics, but so they're seeking knowledge. And laulima, working cooperatively, working together. Strength in numbers. Malama, okay, it's caring for one another, taking care of your neighbors, taking care of your family and your friends. Okay, and then ha'a, be humble, not bragging, not egotistical, narcissistic. I'm better than you. Being humble. Yeah, liberty. I'm my own master. Well, that's my expression. They actually had a master, but the idea was liberty. So they would fight to the death. That's why they killed Captain Cook. They fought back. And the Maoris were even more liberty-oriented, and they fought back very effectively against the English, just like my ancestors. So liberty was important.
features. So these are the values, these are the crucial things to remember that are crucial to a sustainable system. You can't separate agriculture from culture. That's why it's called agriculture. Nowadays they call it agribusiness, industrial agriculture. It's turned into a factory. It's a different ballgame, okay? No, agriculture. It's about how we live. Yeah, we're using agriculture, but we're a community. We're a family. There's a culture behind it. You know, we have certain dances and rituals or festivals, seasons. That's the culture part. Religion, spiritual beliefs, fair play. Fair play would be another word for na'apono, possess a deep sense of justice. So they spread out across the Pacific, and they learned to develop a system that maintained a balance between farmlands and forest lands. The rules were established by a kapu against cutting trees unless 3 new trees were planted. The penalty for breaking kapu was death. The most important tree was the koa, was used to make canoes, surfboards, and other things. The koa tree was a nitrogen-fixing tree. The koa acacia, so the acacia was a nitrogen-fixing trees, and the leaves were used for fertilizer and organic matter. So obviously, if you cut down all the trees, where are you going? That's your fertilizer source. That's your source of raw materials. That's everything. So they were crucially maintaining these forests. And I found out too that the fall of Mayan civilization, and these things can be calculated by the ratio between human population and forest land. Once that ratio gets out of whack, the civilization goes down the tubes. The Maya could no longer do their slash and burn and wait 20-year deal. They were going into bajos, which are like low-lying swamps that had peat deposits that were built up over centuries. And they'd either dig that peat up and haul it to their fields, which were now depleted because they couldn't wait 20 years. They had to go to continual cropping. Or they would eventually go into making canals in these bajos and growing crops directly on the peat in these lowland areas called bajo. It's karst topography, so it's like a sinkhole, kind of a depression in the earth. And eventually they wore that out. Eventually that was done, because took a long time to build up. And then warfare. Then you become resource war. Resource war. We can't produce enough because our soil isn't producing. We've already tried sacrificing people to the gods. That's not working. So the next step is we've got to go conquer our neighbor, take his stuff, kill all his guys, take his stuff. And then, of course, then the whole thing fails. The governmental system, the kings and all that, they're killed by the common people. They move out of these cities. The cities are overgrown with the jungle. You can go there today. Kind of interesting. And the people go back into the forest and farm the way they did, before this civilization developed. So, how did Hawaiians grow crops for larger population than today on rocky lava flows? What was the source of fertility? How was it maintained? The answer may be simple, like I said. Harvesting leaves from the upland forests where they're protected for that use. They sent children up the trees, and they stripped the leaves. They mashed them into the ground with their feet. They used pigs for tillage on the crop at the end of the cropping season. And they used the nut from the kikuyu nut tree for light, to make candles. That was their energy source. And they had a perfectly balanced diet with sweet potatoes, taro, there's starch, and then fish and pork, along with breadfruit, a pretty good range of fruits. and a few vegetables. You use a leaf of the taro to make what they call lao lao, where you stuff it with some fish. They did have chickens. They brought some chickens with them. Yeah, so that's the point. The farming methods were effective until the system changed. Now, the system didn't really, well, it did change in Hawaii, but it wouldn't have if Europeans hadn't shown up. It would have stayed the same, but they had to adapt and change because of Western influence. And the first thing King Kamehameha did when the English showed up with a gunboat, first thing he did, hijacked that gunboat, killed everybody except the navigator and the gunner, used that ship to conquer Maui, unite Hawaii. So these guys, you know, like, no, we're not going to, they would adapt to whatever they get their hands on. And then he hijacking an English gunboat, yeah, that's what he did. And he kept the other guys alive, and they became kind of close lieutenants to the King Kamehameha, the guys that were the gunner and the navigator of ships, because he needed that knowledge and that technology. But they were pretty heavy hitters up until, well, Dole. You heard of Dole pineapple? Sanford Dole. Sugarcane. Unsustainable farming. Who overthrew the Kingdom of Hawaii? Those people. The missionaries, the Christian missionaries from New England, who became the big planters and plantation owners that introduced sugarcane and pineapple. Soil eroded. Now it's tourism. The Hawaiians are now like either moved to the U.S. mainland or they work in the resort industry. And it costs $1 million to buy an average house. I mean, I didn't want to get into that, but that's the sad ending of that story. So these are the plants that they were growing. It means nothing here, pretty much. But the thing of it is, I've studied agricultural systems of the Indians or the Native Americans, First Nation people, from Alaska down the coast, Pacific coast, and how they adapted and what they were doing, okay? And also a lot of different tribes in the Willamette Valley. So they all had a different approach depending on the ecosystem and what was available to them. And they learned to manage the ecosystem successfully. And we're talking about tens of thousands of years until white man brought diseases. The Spanish brought malaria to the Willamette Valley. Not a good thing. But the point of it is it shifted from agriculture to agribusiness. And really what I call it, soil mining. So then the thing is we get as much as we can. We get as much as we can from the land, and then we move on, okay? So when I tell farmers in California or Oregon or here, why are we here? Because we moved from Central Asian steppes across Central Asia into Europe after the Ice Age, and we learned a lot of stuff the hard way. And then we moved on across the Atlantic Ocean. We kept moving west. But now we're at the Pacific Ocean. There's no more moving west. Maybe it's time to learn some of these principles and apply them. Or maybe we don't care. You know, we have a miner mentality. I mean, I'm not saying we do, okay? But there's okay, the Western economic capitalist system is to monetize everything. That included enslaving people and selling them, digging up anything you could dig up and sell. kill any animal you could sell the fur. You know, plow and plant crops until the soil is no longer fertile and it's a weed patch. That's the mentality. So, do we want to be sustainable? Do we want to survive as a civilization? Or not? It's down to that. It's not like using this input or doing this. No, it's way beyond that. Recent data has shown estimates we have maybe 40 to 50 crops left before complete reduction of soil fertility and productivity. And I did a study like that in Idaho on virgin ground. And it was also the USDS and all that. And they were losing a half an inch a year. And along with that, they were losing productivity. And yields were going down after only like less than 100 years of farming that tract after irrigation was developed. And they found there's no replacing that fertility with fertilizers. Once it's gone, it's gone. There's no fooling around. But that's the difference. We're thinking on a different basis. What we can dig up and monetize versus how can we maintain our community? How can we maintain the earth? And how can we maintain happiness and fulfillment? We're spending all our time trying to make money. Are we enjoying ourselves? Anybody? I'm really off on a tangent, but that's what I wanted to do. Okay, so it comes down to this, you know, and don't think that I'm preaching, that I'm trying to sell a product or anything like that. I'm trying to compare information. And I'm not about manipulating people or misrepresenting anything. I'm talking about what I know to be true. After maybe 70 years of being a farmer and a scholar. So, humic substances from decomposition of lignocellulosic materials from broadleaf trees are the key factor to soil development. Period. Humates are concentrated sources of fossil compost, which supply the organic acids and functional group compounds needed for microbial processes that feed higher plants with crucial compounds which help them express the genetic pathway necessary for health and vigor and up the food chain. So that's us, up the food chain. It would take 20 tons or so of uncomposted lignocellulosic materials to equal 1 kilogram of humate product like full humics to provide 800 or so organic compounds. I'm not saying you need to buy it. You can produce your own humic substances. The Hawaiians weren't buying anything. We sell it to them now, though. They were using leaves. You can use leaves. You can use cover crops. You can use biodynamic techniques. You can make compost. You can use pigs. The principle's identical. You know, it's about humification. It's just in Hawaii, it's better because you have warm temperatures year-round. So that kind of works a little better. They didn't need to use compost piles because soil's fine. They had high microbial activity. They never used pesticides. There wasn't anything toxic. You know, it was all good. You know, the microbes were there, evolved there in Hawaii. I had a microbe that I isolated that could eat tar paper. I discovered it by accident. Here's a fungi that's eating tar paper. Wow. Well, then I turned that microbe into something that could break down humic substances and release humic acids. Okay? So, that's about it. Now, I could go into, I don't have any time, but the story of European agricultural development was failure, warfare, and they finally figured out that if you use mixed agriculture, where you raise livestock and you use manure, then you can be somewhat sustainable. They learned that the hard way. They marched across Europe planting crops having crop failures, moving on. But then they did learn, especially, just about all Europeans, learned that mixing livestock with crops was much more, kind of worked. And worked well. And then you could grow grain, and then they could tax you, and then the hierarchy would develop, and then you're peasants again. Okay, question?
I think they forgot that. In Holland.
They forgot it. They forgot it everywhere. Yeah, now we go to monocropping where everybody specializes, and like we work with farmers that the ground has never seen a pound of organic matter or manure since they started farming it, and since they cleared the forest, right? And it goes downhill. I showed some pictures of it. Okay, that's a perfect example. And now when you put humic substances on there, it turns it around, and that can be maintained. But that's not just it. It's not a single factor approach. We're looking at winter annual legumes, crop rotation, still those good practices. And biodynamics is an approach that works, and now scientifically we know a lot of the reasons why it works. And certainly those principles came from the Vedas in India, where people have been farming for thousands and thousands of years. They still are huge populations. They're maintaining those populations. Go back to the Vedas. German and Dutch and some of those languages are Indo-European languages derived from India, from Sanskrit, as we moved across. So we have ancient wisdom. And biodynamics, Steiner, influenced by Goethe, and he was the one that did the famous lectures on biodynamics. But they had studied the Vedas. So it was ancient wisdom that they applied to, in those days, modern times. But nowadays, we're just going off on a tangent, soil mining, paying the banker. The banker creates the wealth off of your back. You sign a paper, they print the money. And now you're a serf. I'm sorry, I'm a little worked up. Tell them the truth, get your head caved in. That's a European saying. But, okay, anybody want to try to cave my head in? Come on. But that's the simple concept here. It doesn't matter whether you're buying stuff or what. You make compost, you decompose organic matter, leaves, it makes humic substances, you get earthworms, you get microbes, everybody's happy, you have a compound cropping system, you rotate crops, you work together, instead of competing. I'm going to sell my stuff cheaper than my neighbor, bringing the whole pricing structure down, that whole thing. The whipsawing, I was in the produce business, so I got some produce to sell. Oh, well, old Joe will sell it to me cheaper. Okay, I'll match his price, And so you get whipsawed down by your neighbor, and then nobody makes anything, and everything starts to collapse. Anyway, that's enough of that. So, I have time for one or two questions, maybe. But I think I got everybody shocked, so. But I think, just remember one thing. Organic matter. Feed the soil to feed the crop. Manage the soil based on criteria we know, like the optimum pH, the saturation of the cation, things we know that were developed, came out of the biodynamic system, and that includes work by Pfeiffer to determine the quality of the compost by fractionation and fractionating the humic substances using paper chromatography. This goes back to 1920s, 1930s. So the information's there, the knowledge is there, the techniques are there. It's the attitude of the farmer. Like, who is brainwashing you? Where is this information coming from? You know, who is the puppet master? Forget all that. It's about you. It's about your family, your culture. Try to maintain it. Fight to the end. Don't let them take you down. Yeah. So that's my little speech. A little preachy, but maybe that's a good thing.